candidate, which is former council member Mike Knapp. Yeah, it's a big deal. It's like 5-0 or something. Yeah. Well, Mr. Knapp, I apologize for the delay. We've been apologizing all day. We started off on the wrong foot and have continued down that road. So we appreciate your patience. And in the light of you waiting so long, I've actually promised that we will go until about 7 o'clock for you.
Great. Sounds perfect.
I wanted to make sure my colleagues were listening. That was it.
You'll be here by yourself, President Rice?
We'll have dinner brought in.
Well, no, I wanted to thank you very much for your prior service and willingness to serve in this role. We're going to go ahead and get started with the predetermined questions that we sent out to you. Then I will turn it over to my colleagues that may have some follow-up questions to some of the responses that you might have had, and some of them have their own individual questions as well. So I'll start off with the first one. Why do you want to be chair of the planning board, and what in your background qualifies you for this role?
Well, thank you, Mr. President. And first, let me thank you all for your diligence today. I know that it's not fun to necessarily be sitting there for 4 and 5 hours, but this is obviously an important position, and I appreciate your interest in the questions that you're asking. So thank you for taking the time and stick-to-itiveness. And I don't envy you. You've got a very good group of candidates to select from, which is nice. And so, but that doesn't necessarily make it easy. So, to your first question, and also before I get started, I don't know if you're tracking the score, but for those of you who are Brazil fans, I apologize.
This is an absolute disaster for the Leventhal household, let me tell you.
Well, it might be best that you're here then. we can stay until the end. Anyway, honestly, I wouldn't have necessarily thought I would be in this position if you asked me 4 years ago. But as I have stepped away from the council and re-engaged in the private sector, I think it's become clearer to me of the role that the planning board can play in the community in so many different levels. And you know that when you're sitting here, but I think once you're kind of seeing the different levels of engagement, it becomes clearer to you. And so that part has been interesting. The part that is also that I'm passionate about is public service and trying to make government work more effectively for its residents. And I think that the planning board presents an opportunity to really address that in spades. So as I've looked at kind of the change that we're seeing as a community, the demographic, the economic, the regional change that we're seeing, some of which is taking place internally, some of which is impacting us from national, international trends that we don't necessarily have control over. When I look at how our county is structured and how our government is structured, the first place where those trends really should be identified and kind of vetted and discussed has to be the planning board, because if we're not capturing it from a planning perspective, there's really no other place in the process for us to begin to capture that. And so when I look at the role that the planning board can play in identifying issues and vetting those issues and starting the community conversation and then presenting you with the issues, the trends for discussion, and then ultimately to identify some of the implications that we see, I think is exciting. And then to be able to take those implications and work those back into the plans that we're beginning to look for as a community, to move us not just from where we are, but to where we need to be. And I think that as I looked and considered that, this opportunity presented itself was very exciting. And I think in order to be successful, the planning board has to have somebody at the helm who has had a good and strong track record of working with and for the community, has to understand the business climate, how businesses operate, and has to understand how government engages and how government operates, and be able to, I think, engage government differently than we have in the past. And so the background that I have, having been a community leader, having served as a business leader in the technology sector, and having been an elected official, serving both locally and in regional capacities, I think I bring a unique perspective to this opportunity that I'm not sure the other candidates, while fabulous candidates, necessarily bring. And so I welcome the opportunity to be considered and look forward to further questions.
Well, thank you very much. What do you feel are the most important issues that are facing the planning board, and what do you think your top 3 priorities would be as chair?
Well, there are obviously any number of issues, and there are a lot of short-term issues. You've got what's laid out in the work plan, but as I stepped back and looked at it, I kind of could distill them down to 3 areas, and those 3 areas are both internal to the organization and external. And I see those areas as being relevance, sustainability, and economic viability. So in the area of relevance, I think that oftentimes an organization or someone thinks that they're relevant when I have to have lots of interactions with people. And the reality is lots of organizations have to go through the planning board. But a lot of that is as a result of the process, the laws, the regulations that require that to be so. I think what we need to do is really modify that so that people are engaging the planning board and it's a value-added process. That you're going there because obviously you have to, but that you are coming away with real and tangible results and moving your project, your product, your idea, your concept forward. And if you're not, you're getting feedback as to what needs to be changed to allow for that to occur. And I think that relevance is important as you engage the council. I look at some of the things that have occurred over the past years, and I'm not sure the level of engagement has occurred so that you are relying on the planning board as your planning partner and your advisor. And I think that that relationship needs to be made much more relevant. And so I look at that first step as relevance. The second issue I see is one of sustainability. Sustainability is a word that is often co-opted, overused, and yet I think is also very, very important in this instance. Looking at what you've had to deal with over the last 6 years through the recession, sustainability is an issue that addresses and confronts everything that we're trying to do. And so when we look at the fiscal climate, the planning board has to make sure that it is sustainable from that perspective. As we look at the environmental issues we're addressing, we have to address sustainability from that perspective. And so when you look kind of across the spectrum, in all aspects of what the planning board is looking at, sustainability has to be something that's considered and has to be part of the framework that we use to assess. And then the third piece, economic viability. Obviously, we have a strong economy here. We've seen that. We've seen how we've been somewhat less impacted through the recession. We see how things have started to recover, and yet we know we're overly reliant on the federal sector, and so we've got to begin to look at ways to improve upon that. And I think that the planning board has to come up with new alternatives to present you to look at ways that we can incentivize increased economic viability. I just recently read an article from Brookings Institute on the rise of innovation districts. And so when you look at the type of things that we want to be doing here as it relates to commercial development, technology development, what should our economy be based on, there are many, many jurisdictions in the country that are both in urban, suburban, and exurban areas that are modifying themselves to create more robust mixed-use environments that allow for the type of open-source interaction that leads to a lot of increased commercial activity. We have started that, but we haven't really fully embraced it. And so yet we have a lot of the raw materials here that we need to be able to take advantage of to see that happen. And I think the planning board has to identify those elements and bring you alternatives that you can look at and bring the right pieces together. You're going to have to bring a strong network of leadership that says we're all on the same page. We're going to have to identify the technologies and the individuals that can begin to implement that. We're also going to have to reach into communities we haven't typically reached into, our lower income communities, our underperforming communities, because that's where, interestingly, a lot of the innovation districts are taking place and are most successful. But we have to be doing that from a planning board perspective and presenting that to you to increase that level of economic viability. And so when I look at those three priorities, I think there are three tools we need to use to be able to see successful outcomes. We've got to do it through learning, engagement, and facilitation. We have to undertake learning and fostering, looking at new ideas and new concepts. We have to welcome that. I know a lot of times we end up stuck because we ask the question, well, where else has that been successful? Where else has that worked? we're kind of leading the country in a lot of different areas and some of the issues and some of the trends that we have. There may be some places we can't necessarily find all of the right answers to the questions. And so how do we learn it and vet it and make sure that we're fostering new learning and making sure that we're bringing that to the table? Engagement. As we do learning, whether it's through planning board staff, engaging with the council, engaging with government, with the community, the next step has to be to recognize all the people that weren't a part of that conversation and make sure we reach out and engage them so that they understand what are some of the new concepts, why are they new concepts, what are the challenges with those concepts so that they are also part of that conversation. And then ultimately, we've got to facilitate the next steps to make sure that we get all of the stakeholders that ultimately can not just hold their nose and say, I won't be against a plan, but actually are advocates for a plan and are really working to get to an outcome. So I think using those tools, we can affect and impact those three priorities.
Well, thank you very much. What is your understanding of the role of chair as it relates to other members of the board and then also to the council?
There was once a time when I thought serving as a chair meant that you got to be in charge. And then I got to participate in activities at the county council and at COG and TPB, and I realized that's not the case at all. And it's a very good lesson to learn, and people need to learn it sooner than later, because the reality is, as chair of an organization, it's your job to understand what the organization has to do, what are the requirements, what are the things that are on the schedule, what are the things that need to get done, and then try to formulate strategies that allow for that to occur by working with your colleagues to understand what it is that they need to accomplish, what they want to accomplish, what their ideas are, and ultimately, ideally, pulling a consensus among, in this case, the 5 members that you have, but at the very least, a majority of those members to be able to give clear direction and guidance to the management and staff so they can actually implement the functions of the organization. And so that's what I see from a planning perspective. From a council perspective, it's not all that different from a relationship perspective, because given the role that the planning board has, I think the chair has to engage each of you proactively and effectively to understand the needs that you have and the needs that your district has to ensure that those issues are at least on the table as activities are moving forward and are being discussed. That doesn't mean that at the end of the day everybody's going to get everything that they want and everything that they need, but that has to be a part of the conversation. The other piece needs to be that we are proactively bringing information to you, because really you shouldn't be getting caught off guard. If there are new concepts, new ideas, new things that we're bringing to the table for you to ultimately consider, we need to make sure that you have an understanding of that, ideally in advance of the time that it gets in front of you, so that by the time it does, you're in a position to be able to make the appropriate decisions that you need to make from a policy perspective and feel that you've been well served. And so that's what I see as the relationship between the planning chair and then the council.
So how do you think that we should deal with future development and redevelopment issues, and what's the planning board's role in supporting existing communities as a part of that whole mix?
Sure. Obviously, as we're moving well past the notion of greenfields development in Montgomery County, and so much of what we're doing now is more complicated, more complex. It's infill, it's redevelopment, and so that requires us having a good understanding of where are existing communities and what are the needs and how do we support those existing communities. The interesting thing is, and having been a part of a lot of these conversations, you end up in a situation where either everything is great and so nothing needs to change, and so the answer for the existing community is don't do anything, or we've had the other end of the spectrum, which is things are changing and people need to understand it and accept it, and we need to move on to the next level, which then doesn't really take the community into account. I think the reality is that we have strengths in all of our communities throughout the county, some more, some less. And I think the job of the planning board is to be able to work with the community to understand where those strengths exist and where those weaknesses exist, and be able to then make recommendations on that basis. Two examples. So we have the Ag Reserve, and so when we look at the Ag Reserve, it's a pretty clear concept of what we put out there. We want to preserve agriculture. We want to make sure we have the open space that exists, and the way to do that is to make sure that agriculture is successful in perpetuity. Well, that's great, except the reality is that what makes agriculture successful changes because there are a lot of other dynamics that come into play. So 6 years ago, we began to recognize that it was very challenging for an aging farmer whose family no longer wanted to necessarily be engaged in farming to sell their property at a price that was different from what it would cost them to what it would cost to develop. Well, if I'm going to build a farm and be a farmer, I can't pay that much for that land. And so as a result of that, we recognize the need to put in place the building lot termination program, which allowed us to not solve the problem, but at least put a tool out there that allowed for farming to occur. So we built on what was the strength of there, which is having farming go on, and augmented that with some different tools. Looking at the other end of the spectrum, we're going to be addressing Bethesda in the coming months. Bethesda has tremendous strengths and assets, and the challenge there is to how do you build upon those and really embrace those. And there are a lot of key characteristics that are there that are very exciting, and yet we also know that we want to be looking to our next generation so that our innovators, our entrepreneurs are looking at this as a place to not just locate a business or locate a family, but really create a community where I have both of those right here. So we've got a thriving business community and we've got a thriving community. Well, we're not going to usurp everything that's there. That's what's going to be the base that allows us to build on that. But you're probably not going to get there by keeping everything exactly the same either. And so I think that those are two examples that point to things we have to take into consideration as we look at existing communities and trying to preserve that, but also address the needs going forward.
So you kind of touched on it, but many of the council's land use decisions require balancing the community's desires for further economic development, neighborhood protection, and enhanced environmental protection. And, what factors would you look at in trying to achieve that reasonable balance in those particular kinds of cases?
Sure. And I like those three together because it's interesting, and as you talk to different groups, as we all have over the course of the last 4 or 5 months, a lot of times those are presented as somewhat mutually exclusive or false choices. You can do one or the other, but you certainly can't do all three. And it's interesting to me because as I think back of activities that have taken place here at the council and within the region, two prime examples I think are probably some of the most successful examples of planning and implementation actually have embraced those three very, very effectively, and that's what made them successful. So when I look at that and I look at the characteristics I would try to capture, I think these two examples identify this. So what we did with White Flint Sector Plan, in White Flint, we probably had a level of engagement that was I don't think we've ever seen, probably, but certainly not in the last 10 to 15 years, at how you got the community engaged to identify the issues of existing neighborhoods, environment, and economic development. And because of that level of engagement and the issues that were put on the table, we actually got to a very robust and I think a very exciting plan. Now, time will tell as the development occurs. We can't assess it fully until we see what happens next, but I think what we got to was a plan that embraced those elements and ultimately was as well received as probably any plan that we've adopted in a very long time. As far as implementation, I look across the river to the Roslyn-Ballston corridor, and I look at what's taken place in Arlington, where 30 years ago, or probably a little more than that now, there was a decision made to say, we have this and we have to, in order for us to be a dynamic community, we're going to have to address these issues. We have a transit corridor that we're going to have to create density in to allow our economic base to grow. If we do that, we're going to have to make sure that we preserve our existing neighborhoods that are immediately adjacent to that. But if we do those things, we're actually going to end up reducing congestion, which is going to improve our environmental situation. And through steadfastness and through community engagement and through really some elements of trial and error, but the nice thing is it's a trial and error that occurred 16 miles away, we can learn from those activities and say how do we really embrace that and not only do it once, but really continue to maintain that because they are continuing to implement that and make refinements and make improvements. Their trolley car issue notwithstanding. So I look at those as examples of how we have done it and how we've embraced those three elements and been successful. And I think that we take pieces from each of those as we look at activities throughout the rest of the county moving forward.
What is your view of the planning board's overall responsibility when it comes to our park system, and what do you see as the chair's role related directly to our parks?
Simply, I see our role as guidance, oversight, stewardship, and advocacy. Parks are great and everybody loves them. You can look at the surveys. I think 97% of the people who use the park think they're are a wonderful asset. And so clearly the people who are engaging in those parks love them and want to see them maintained. And if you talk to others, it's an asset certainly if they're not taking advantage of, they know exists and would like to spend more time there. So we have to continue to support and maintain that, and I think one of the biggest issues we have to address there is continued focus on maintenance of that infrastructure, which we know, as has been the case with all other infrastructure in the county, it is challenging to do, and yet it's a tremendous asset, and if we want people to continue to avail themselves of that resource, we have to make sure that they are well maintained and well kept up, and so I think we've got to continue to address that. Probably the most significant issue we need to do in the short term is to find somebody who can adequately pick up the reins where Mary Bradford left off. She laid a very solid foundation and really got the parks to a place that is a very good place. And now we need to make sure that we have the right leadership in place from. Oh, okay. Unless we already did that. I didn't. I saw interim. I didn't see the replacement. Sorry. But then we need to support that individual because that person has pretty big shoes to fill. And so we've got to make sure that we're providing the right guidance and support to make that occur. We also, I think, need to look at those changing dynamics within our community. So we are an aging community. What do we do to continue to make sure that our aging population can avail themselves of parks as a resource and an asset? So we have to look at that. And we also obviously continue to diversify. And as we continue to grow in different directions, how do we make sure that the parks are accessible to all of the users? One of the things that's exciting, and I think it's something that you all put in place a number of years ago, but set up a situation where parks and the Department of Recreation are working much more closely together. And I know, at least having read through the annual report, that progress has been made. I don't know to the degree that it's been made that we would all like it, but I think certainly they're much further ahead of where they were. And as I look at where we need to go going forward and going back to the sustainability issue, if we can make sure that Parks is focusing on the geography and the access to that asset, and we can leverage the planning and the logistics within the Department of Recreation, so we can really be looking at new and innovative programming. You're now really coming up with a model that leverages both of our county's assets very effectively and really sets ourselves up well for the future.
Well, thank you very much. And Mike Riley is our new.
Fabulous!
Yes. So
good, excellent choice.
Yeah, very much so. We're very excited. Now, you know this position carries with it obligations for attending meetings, making appearances that happen both evenings, weekends, and will you make the time commitments required to fulfill these elements of the role? And then, it's kind of silly for me to ask, but have you engaged in community outreach activities? If so, what were they?
Yes and yes. As you know from doing this job and having watched park and planning both intimately and also at a distance, community engagement is really probably one of the most significant activities that takes place. And I think it's also one of the most challenging because how do you identify people who don't know to be identified? And so we have to really spend a lot of time doing that. I was struck a number of years ago by one of the activities that the planning staff undertook, and I forget which community they were doing this in, where they actually started going to different night classes that were taking place, in particular ESOL classes, to present for 15 minutes to folks they wouldn't have typically gotten to present just here's what we're doing, here's why we're doing it, and you might be interested, and here's where you would go to find us for more information. I think we need to continue to do more opportunities like that. And so I think we need to take that level of engagement. Obviously, social media is huge and only getting bigger, and we need to continue to look for new ways to deploy that and also to deploy that to communities we don't typically get to. Obviously, to show up and participate in the things that Park and Planning has always done, I think is good and worthwhile. I've also found that showing up to things that you're not supposed to be showing up to, or people don't expect you to show up at, is where you learn tremendous amounts of things. And so I think it's very good to identify those as opportunities in which to engage, because you learn a lot from those types of activities. And so those are just a sampling of things I've done and of things I think we need to look to going forward.
Excellent. When it comes to conflicts of interest, I'm going to skip the standard question because based on the responses that you gave, there are two follow-up questions that we do have that are a little bit more specific. You told us that you own in whole or in part 2 business entities that have done business with or sought to do business with Montgomery County, Prince George's County, or Prince George's County Public Schools. If you're appointed chair, does either company plan to continue doing business with any of these government entities or any other local government agency in either county? And if so, how would you propose to avoid a conflict of interest or an appearance of a conflict with your position as chair?
Thank you for the question. There are no direct conflicts with Park and Planning with anything that we've done, but to clarify the points that you just raised, the consulting firm that I started, Orion Ventures, has been working with municipalities in the county and state in the areas of strategic planning for economic development with a particular focus on technology and innovation areas. If I were to be appointed, I would no longer serve as the principal engaging with those activities and would serve in an advisory role to any team members that would be engaging clients. Alternatively, and it's always kind of a chicken and egg scenario, we've had some conversations that if some of our customers or clients have been pleased with the work that we've done and would like to retain some of our expertise going forward, and so it may make sense for them to engage some of the folks who've been working with me directly as opposed to doing it through Orion Ventures. And so we haven't had that conversation yet except peripherally because a decision didn't need to get made. The second firm that I've co-founded, SkillSmart, is developing a software platform to provide assistance to employers and job seekers to address the skills gap in the workplace. And we have a broad array of prospective clients in the hospitality, healthcare, and technology sectors. Some of these engagements could include local education providers or local governments. So, for example, we're having conversations right now with a hospitality organization that is expanding in Prince George's County that, in order to implement what it is that they're looking to do, may engage parts of Prince George's County schools or local government. It's just not clear at this point. In that organization, I am a major shareholder, but I'm not a majority shareholder, and if those engagements were to take place and require interaction with MCPS, Montgomery County Government, Prince George's, my co-founder and partner would engage in those activities, and I would not be involved. Do you want me to do the college one too, or do you?
Sure, you can go ahead. That's the next question. So
I also serve on the board of trustees for Montgomery College, and this is a volunteer appointment, so there's no financial conflict. As many of you are aware, in the past, I think the most recent example was with the expansion of the Germantown campus. There are some land use decisions that come before the planning board that may come through the college. If that were to be the case, I would work with the president and general counsel there to make sure that there was sufficient notification so I could recuse myself from anything that was taking place there. And I have not yet had a conversation with counsel at Park and Planning as to if I were to recuse myself from one side, would I also need to recuse myself at the planning board, or is that sufficient to have recused myself and not partake in any activities at the college, so as to allow me to work within the planning board? I just haven't had that conversation with the planning folks yet, but I think that that's a way to address that.
All right, and. Last but not least, are there other points about your interest in the chair position that you'd like to call to the council's attention?
In light of the time, I've got a 7 or 8 page document I could read, so we can. No, I just really appreciate the opportunity to be among the folks that you've selected to interview today, and would welcome the opportunity to work more closely with you in the weeks, months, and years going forward.
All right, I'm going to lead Councilmember Leventhal, who normally is the lead off on the individual question. So, Councilmember Leventhal.
Well, I served with Mr. Knapp for 8 years, so I was asking each applicant because I didn't know their position, whether they supported the locally preferred alternative for the Purple Line, including the Georgetown branch right-of-way. I'm familiar with your position on that.
Yes.
I also have asked each applicant what was his or her vision for what the county needed to do to maintain the ag reserve, and you've already addressed that in your remarks. So to be fair, I'm letting you know that I had those questions. If you wish to speak to them briefly, you may, but I already feel like I know your position on both of those topics.
Yes, on the Purple Line and the ag reserve, I mean, I touched on it briefly. I think we're actually at an exciting time with the ag reserve, and one of the challenges that we face is how do we continue to make agriculture viable? And I think we're going to need to look for additional tools and techniques. In the time that I have not been on the council, I've actually been working with the town of Poolesville, looking at some different strategies, and it's been really exciting to see some of the new farmers and farming activities that are taking place. Folks who actually weren't in farming before but come from an entrepreneurial background and now have recognized the market opportunities to be in farming. And so it's interesting and exciting, and I want to learn more as to what it is that's encouraging them to get there and work with, I think, the planning. I think the planning staff needs to be working with the county to kind of identify what are the unique characteristics and what tools can we put in place to further incentivize that.
Thank you very much, Councilmember Leventhal. Councilmember Berliner.
Mr. Knapp, I just wanted to say to you that since you've left the council, we've had an opportunity to work together on a number of issues, and I've always found it to be a very enriching experience. I really think you have a very fine mind and a good grasp of a lot of different issues. I've enjoyed working with you on workforce development. I've enjoyed working with you on Poolesville, sets of issues, the ag reserve. I know Mr. Elrich and I are looking forward to a few more vineyards in the ag reserve,
yes.
and that we hope that that's part of the economic activity that develops in our county. But I really have been very impressed with a wide range of your intellect and your approach to issues. Even as you were speaking today about innovation districts, I immediately went online as someone who had sponsored the legislation to create the Office of Innovation in our county. I immediately jumped on the website of the Brookings and looked at what it was to have an innovation district, and I hope as we take a look at things like the White Oak Center master plan and the Bethesda master plan, that we will give serious consideration to moving forward with an innovation district, because it is exactly the kinds of things that we want to do. We do have unique assets, and Ms. Navarro is part of the district, and Ms. and Cherie's district, of saying these are places where we can make that happen and should make that happen. So one of the things I've enjoyed about this process is learning from the applicants, and you certainly have contributed to that.
Thank you.
I did want to have a brief follow-up because I was unclear about your statements on the conflict of interest, if you will,
Sure.
on the first one in particular. So I'm straight out, let's assume for purposes of this conversation, this job's going to pay pretty well. We don't know what it's going to pay, but it's going to pay pretty well, and it's pretty full-time. So tell me what ongoing relationship, if any, you would have with the entities,
Sure.
either financially or your time-wise, because this is a serious gig.
The biggest issue would be, so for example, we've been working with the county, the state, and NIST in implementing the National Cybersecurity Center of Excellence. And so over the course of the last 18 months, we've been working with a lot of different organizations and concepts. I think I have staff or members who have worked on our team who can take the lead on that. But like it or not, I've had 18 months of engagement that I can't fully impart to someone else because I don't know what the issues are arise. And so I would provide some advisory perspective to the extent that would be necessary to make sure that there's continuity for things that have come up, so people know what we did and be able to address that going forward. So that would be it. So I don't see that as a significant time commitment, but certainly I want to make sure that that's available if someone else were to pick up that ball and carry it forward.
Thank you.
Councilmember Navarro.
Thank you so much, Mr. Knapp. It's good
Thank you.
to see you again. I really appreciate that you have put your name up to this, and really obviously very appreciative of all your service here on the council, and you continue to do so many wonderful things. I basically asked every single applicant the same question. You've already addressed some of it, and it had to do just with the fact that, yes, we're a very different county, we're aging, want to attract millennials. We have a growing immigrant community. It's been growing for the last 30 years. And so just, general ideas as to how would you pursue then opportunities for engaging for folks to participate in this very important process, land use that affects everybody. So what would be some of those innovative ideas? I know you alluded to some of them, but if you had any additional thoughts on that.
Honestly, when we look at the communities that are not typically engaging, I wish it would be so simple as to come up with a new social media strategy to reach out to them. I think with the younger population that may be possible, and so I think it would be interesting to explore some what is it that resonates. And so I think I don't know that that the expertise would necessarily reside within park and planning. I think we would have to engage some other folks to really look at how to capture that millennial age group that is really honing in very specifically on the types of information they want to receive and not much else. And so how do you kind of break through that bubble? So I think we would have to employ that there. A lot of our other populations, quite honestly, I wish it were so simple to use social media. And I think the reality there is going to be much more shoe leather focused. And it's going to require the organization not so much focusing on this is how we've done it. We announce that we're having a meeting, and we hope that people get there. And we try to send mailings out to different communities or different neighborhoods in hopes that it catches someplace it didn't before. I think we're going to we would have to undertake some door knocking campaigns, some really just doing real specific outreach in targeted places to engage. And even with that, I'm not sure that ultimately gets those populations to come participate in a larger community meeting, because I'm still not sure that they're going to feel as welcome as they would, or that they have the knowledge to engage at that level. And so it may require us actually bringing materials to specific groups that they help organize, because that at least will get people to a comfort level on the subject matter that will then perhaps allow them to engage more broadly. And maybe even not at that point, but we can certainly solicit their feedback and incorporate that back into the dialogue. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Councilmember Navarro. Councilmember Andrews.
Hi, Ms. Knapp. Nice to see you again.
Hello, sir.
And thank you for your interest in serving as chair of the Planning Board. I've asked this question about everybody, and that is, what is the most valid criticism that you've heard about the Planning Board, and how would you address it as chair?
I think probably the most significant criticism is that of accountability. That people struggle to determine who's making decisions, and if decisions aren't made in a direction that they like, how do they address that? But more importantly, if decisions aren't made or things lag inordinately, what happens? Who cares? Is there an implication any place along the way? I think that if that were simple, to some degree it would have been done already. But I think part of it is really is management, and really engaging with the park and planning directors, and identifying more customer service oriented metrics and ways to track things internally, so that we can then continue to monitor that. And I think also it's very important to provide a level of support and, again, kind of stick-to-itiveness behind the management within the organization. I think it's easy for us to say, we've got to be more accountable, we have to do these things. And then all of the other issues that show up overtake that. And I think especially in dealing with personnel, it's something that you have to focus in on each and every day and continue to impress the importance of it upon the organization. So that way, I'm not sure people are going to be thrilled with it, but over some period of time, and I don't know if that's 12, 18, 24, 36 months, but unfortunately it's probably not fast, you begin to slowly change that culture of accountability. And as you change that, I think you see your top performers performing better. I think you see your middle performers gravitating toward the top, because that measure of accountability is appreciated and recognized. And I think you start to see your lower performers moving out or moving away from things, because they know there's going to be a level of accountability that they can't escape.
Thank you. My second question is, what do you think is a reasonable starting salary for a new chair of the Planning Board?
Probably somewhere in line. I don't know if you average what's out there for county department directors, but certainly looking at comparably sized organizations within county government and pricing it accordingly. And I don't know off the top of my head what those numbers look like, but you certainly know the size of the budgets of each of those departments and the size and the budget of the planning board, and so I think that you have or park and planning, so you can look at it and find the comparables.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Councilmember Andrews. Councilmember Branson.
Thank you. It's good to see you, Mr. Knapp.
Nice to see you.
I wanted to ask you the same question I'm asking everyone, which is simply this. The last few members, chairs of the planning board have only served for one term. There's got to be a reason for that. I'm not sure I know what it is. So I want your take on what do you think may have caused this one-termitis, and whatever it is, what would you do to fix it?
Well, interestingly, I think each of them was there for one term for very different reasons. I think the situation we saw with Mr. Berlage was a result of something we hadn't seen in this county for, I think, probably ever, as we saw what happened in Clarksburg. I think as a result of something that went awry in our planning process, it wasn't clear how to address it, how to fix it, and the snowball was rolling downhill, and there wasn't anybody that could kind of get in the way and stop it. And so I think that led to a change in leadership at that point. I think with Dr. Hansen, in an effort to try to return us to a semblance of stability and some knowledge of kind of what the planning board had done in the past, he was a very good candidate. In fact, I'm not sure how many other candidates we had at that time, but there weren't many. And I think that he did a very good job of getting us to a stable situation, and then I think, candidly, we were in a different place today, or 4 years ago, than we were 30 years ago. And the role that the planning board had then versus the role that the planning board has now, or had 4 years ago, was very different. And I think he was struggling with that, and I think that the council was struggling with that from the other side. And I think that created a level of frustration in which he chose to do other things. And he obviously has many, many interests and is having a good time writing books and fly fishing, as I understand it. And then I think that with Ms. Carrier, I think she brought a tremendous skill set to bear, and I think that I don't know if some of the external facing elements and requirements for the position were necessarily things that she had done in the past. And so, I mean, I think engaging different elements of county government at the level that is required, I'm not sure was necessarily a strength. That being said, I think many other characteristics she brought were very good and were very helpful at kind of moving the ball forward. So I think you have three very different assessments or decisions that were made in three individuals in three different times. Going forward, on the plus side, I think we are at a somewhat more stable environment as far as the internal works of the planning board. That being said, I think a number of things on the work plan, as we talked about earlier, you have some complicated and complex issues. I don't think just because we're not necessarily doing grand and glorious master plans from inception, I think a lot of the things that the planning board will be doing are tricky and are complex, and I think that requires a significant level of engagement within the organization and with each of you. And I think if the right relationship, the right tone, the right structures are put in place, I think you can get past having one-termers. But I think some of that also, some depends upon the activities and efforts of the planning board chair, and candidly, I think some also rests with the 9 council members who are on that side of the dais to make sure we have engaged in the right relationship, and so that people see that and respect it, and that we're making good progress.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Councilmember Branson. Councilmember Elrich.
Okay. First question.
Yes, sir.
If we get a plan from the planning board where we know it's been substantially changed from a staff recommendation, would you have problems with staff being able to discuss the basis of the recommendations with the council?
Ideally, I would be doing that if I were in that capacity. We would be able to. I think it's important. These are all public documents and they're all public processes. And so if we start here, the planning board goes to here and sends you something that looks like this. It's going to be real important for you to understand how you got from here to here, and so whether that's the planning board chair coming up and having a good understanding of that, or having the planning director and staff coming up and engaging. I think it's going to be important for you to understand how those changes occurred. So I'm not necessarily sure I know the best mechanism to make that happen. But if there's a lack of understanding as to why those changes occurred and how those initial decisions were made, then it's necessarily going to be an issue when we sit here in front of the council. And so it makes a heck of a lot more sense to try and address it on the front end than to try and figure out how to do it sitting in the days in front of you.
Okay. Given that we've got a shortage of affordable housing and it's likely to be exacerbated by the income spreads and what's projected as the future growth in the county, how would you treat the existing naturally occurring affordable housing that exists in the county today when looking at master plans or zoning code changes?
It's a good question. I think we've got to try to retain our affordable housing stock. One of the frustrations I think that I have seen is, and I struggle with this personally, because the general premise is, the laws of supply and demand, and that as we increase the supply of housing, we should reduce, stabilize housing prices in general. We're not really seeing that. And so, and I'm not necessarily seeing, even in places where we have provide for significant residential development, that the prices that are at least forecast for there are going to be at a point that is going to be deemed affordable, depending upon however you want to use that definition. I don't know that I have the strategy, because I don't know that there is one yet. I think we obviously are going to have to do an assessment of the affordable housing stock that we have. And we're going to have to come up with some interesting strategies. But I don't think if it were a simple and straightforward thing, I know this has been a dialogue we've had for the last 15 years, that it would, we'd have come up with something by now. And so we're going to have to work really hard on that one.
Okay. So when you were on the council, you were a veteran of the discussions of the frustration of the lack of coordination or sometime entanglement between our side and Park and Planning as an agency, and then many of us have discussed, is there a way to make this easier? Do you have any thoughts on reorganization, what you would see doing, would be interested in doing, if you were to be the chair?
One of the first things, and I'm sure this will go over great down in Silver Spring, but I'll say it anyway. I think that there tends to be a focus on, well, we're an independent organization and therefore we should operate independently and we can do these things and we can throw it over the wall because that's our job to be independent. I don't believe it's Park and Planning's job to be independent. I believe it's Park and Planning's job to be a government agency that serves the residents of our community, like all of the other government departments and agencies that we have. And so I think that organizationally, we need to identify ways in which we can build that coordination in, because if I'm a person walking in off the street, I don't know that Park and Planning is independent or anything. I'm walking into county government. I need somebody to help me. And so I think we need to build relationships in places that don't exist. I think we need to both encourage and enhance those efforts from the Park and Planning side, but I also think from a management perspective that it's incumbent upon the chair to engage other department heads and other parts of the council and staff to facilitate some of that process from the other side. I think there's also a reticence on the parts of some of the other organizations to engage because for the last 7 years nobody listened to me, so why should I listen to them? And so I think that recognizing that those issues exist, whether you like it or not, there's going to have to be some element of mediation that the planning board chair and ultimately management are going to have to engage in, and we're going to have to continue to support that. And where we don't see the progress we'd like, we're going to have to try, then we'll have to take it up levels and get other levels of management engaged. But I think that, again, this gets back to the point of it's not something that's going to change overnight. I think you're going to have to identify it as an issue. You're going to have to continue to focus on it with staff on all sides, and you're going to have to continue to mediate and facilitate progress. And we're going to have to identify ways in which that occurs, and we're going to have to give a little, and make sure that at the end of the day we need a successful outcome. Do we care whose successful outcome it was, really? I don't know that we do if we get to a successful outcome. And I think that's where we have to get people oriented.
Okay. My last question is, with the point system for the CR zones, there's been some continuing discussion of that. Do you have any thoughts on how they're working and any changes you might be interested in making?
Honestly, I don't at this point. Just haven't had the level of involvement, engagement of the point system. I've heard some anecdotal things, but to kind of base an answer on that would not be sufficient.
Honestly works. Thank you.
Well, Mr. Knapp, I want to thank you for your previous service and also your willingness to serve in a new capacity and role. We will be making a decision within approximately a week, and we'll be in contact with you shortly. So I want to thank you very much for coming out this evening. Ladies and gentlemen, to you on the dais, I really want to thank